The sound of sirens pierced the evening air as Marcus watched his 73-year-old neighbor being led away in handcuffs, her final words echoing across the destroyed backyard. "You should have listened when I told you about my dog." What started as a complaint about pool noise had spiraled into something. No one saw coming a vendetta that would expose dark secrets, shatter lives, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemies live right next door. The doorbell's shrill ring cut through the Saturday morning calm like a blade. Marcus Chen paused mid-stroke, his pool skimmer suspended over the crystal-clear water that reflected the Arizona sun in dancing diamonds. He'd been up since dawn, methodically cleaning the oasis he'd spent 3 years perfecting every tile, hand-selected, every curve engineered for both beauty and function. "Coming," he called, setting the skimmer aside and padding across the warm concrete in his bare feet. Through the frosted glass panels of his front door, he could make out a slight figure, shoulders rigid with purpose. Karen Whitmore stood on his doorstep like a sentinel of grievance, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her weathered face taut. At 73, she carried herself with the brittle authority of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of righteous indignation. Her pale blue eyes, magnified behind thick glasses, fixed on Marcus with laser intensity. "We need to talk," she announced before he could offer a greeting. Marcus blinked, still adjusting to the shift from peaceful morning routine to whatever storm had blown up to his door. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore. What can I do for you?" "It's about your pool." The words came out clipped, precise, as if she'd rehearsed them. "The noise is causing my precious emotional distress." For a moment, Marcus wondered if he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, emotional distress, my dog," Karen clarified, though her tone suggested he should have understood immediately. "The constant splashing, the filter running all hours. Precious hasn't slept properly in weeks. She's developing anxiety disorders." Marcus glanced past Karen toward her house, a mirror image of his own. In their planned community, Desert Palms Estates, every home came with the same architectural blueprint, the same postage stamp yard, the same HOA-approved color palette. The only difference was what people chose to do with their small slice of paradise. Marcus had chosen water and life. Karen, from what he could see, had chosen surveillance and complaint. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not sure I understand. The pool equipment runs on timers. It's only active during permitted hours, according to HOA guidelines. And as for splashing," he gestured helplessly, "I live alone. I barely use it except for morning laps." Karen's mouth tightened into a line thin as razor. "Why are dogs hear frequencies? We don't. The vibrations travel through the ground. Precious is a sensitive breed of purebred Maltese worth more than your car. She requires specific environmental conditions." The absurdity of the conversation began to settle over Marcus like heat shimmer. He'd moved to Desert Palms 6 months ago, seeking peace after his divorce. Drawn by the promise of quiet neighborhood living, he'd researched every regulation, followed every rule, even paid extra for the quietest pool equipment available. Now he was being accused of psychologically damaging a dog he'd never even seen. "Look," he said, keeping his voice level, "I'm sorry if there's been some disturbance, but sorry doesn't fix trauma," Karen snapped. "I've been documenting everything. Times, dates, decibel levels. I have a noise meter app on my phone. Yesterday at 6:47 a.m., your filter registered a sustained 38 decibels from my bedroom window." Marcus stared at her. That's quieter than a library. For humans, perhaps, but Precious has suffered enough." Karen's voice cracked slightly, and for a moment, something raw and desperate flickered behind her glasses. "First, my Harold. Now this, she's all I have left, and I won't let you take her peace away too." The mention of Harold, her late husband, who'd passed the previous winter, shifted something in Marcus's chest. He'd heard about it from other neighbors. Whispered conversations about the widow next door who rarely left her house anymore. Grief could twist people into shapes they'd never recognize. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "I had no idea you were dealing with this. Maybe we could find a compromise. The compromise is simple." Karen straightened, her moment of vulnerability snapping shut like a steel trap. "Turn off the pool equipment during nighttime hours, 7 p.m. to 8 a.m. Complete silence." Marcus felt his jaw drop. That's 13 hours. The filtration system needs to run at least 8 hours daily, or the water will turn into a swamp. It's basic chemistry. Then maybe you shouldn't have installed a pool without considering your neighbors. The words hit like a slap. Marcus had spent his entire savings on this house, this dream. After 20 years of marriage to Sarah, who'd criticized every decision he made, he'd finally found a place where he could breathe. The pool wasn't just recreation, it was meditation, exercise. His daily reminder that he'd built something beautiful from the wreckage of his old life. "The pool was here when I bought the house," he said, his patience finally showing cracks. "The previous owners used it daily." "Did they cause emotional distress to your dog too?" Karen's face flushed crimson. The Hendersons were considerate. People they understood community responsibility. "You're just a selfish transplant who thinks money gives you the right to disturb the peace." The word transplant stung more than it should have. Marcus had heard it before from certain neighbors, a casual dismissal that marked him as an outsider, despite his legal residency, his tax payments, his attempts to fit in. In Karen's mouth, it sounded like a curse. "I'm trying to be reasonable." "Here," Marcus said, his voice hardening despite his efforts, "but I'm not shutting down a perfectly legal pool because your dog allegedly has anxiety." Allegedly. Karen's voice rose to a pitch that could shatter glass. "Are you calling me a liar? I'm saying dogs adapt. Maybe if you don't, you dare. Tell me how to care for my precious." Karen stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell her aggressive perfume and see the network of lines around her eyes, carved deep by years of squinting and disapproval. "I raised 3 children, ran a household for 50 years, and I know distress when I see it." The conversation had crossed into territory Marcus didn't recognize, a place where rationality went to die and grievance took root like desert weeds, hardy and impossible to kill. He could see neighbors starting to notice, Mrs. Patterson from across the street pausing her morning walk, the Garcias slowing their jog. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think we should both take a step back." "I've taken enough steps back." Karen's voice cracked like a whip. "Harold always said I was too accommodating. Too willing to let people walk over me. Well, Harold's gone, and I'm done being accommodating." She spun on her heel and marched toward her house, her small frame vibrating with fury. At her door, she turned back, her voice carrying across the distance with crystal clarity. 48 hours to comply with my request, Mr. Chen. After that, I'll be forced to explore other options." The threat hung in the desert air like smoke. Marcus watched her disappear into her house, the door slamming with a finality that seemed to echo off every surface in the neighborhood. Around him, the morning resumed its rhythm sprinklers cycling on, garage doors rumbling open, the distant hum of air conditioners fighting the rising heat. But something had shifted. As Marcus walked back to his pool, the water that had seemed so perfect moments before now looked different, vulnerable, exposed. He picked up his skimmer with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding that his sanctuary was under siege. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Karen Whitmore had already begun making phone calls. By noon, she'd contacted the HOA, the city noise complaint office, and a lawyer who specialized in nuisance claims. By evening, she'd started a neighborhood petition, and by the time Marcus went to bed that night, listening to the gentle hum of his pool filter, the same sound that had lulled him to sleep for 6 peaceful months. Karen was standing at her bedroom window, documenting the decibel readings with the dedication of a scientist and the fury of a woman who had already decided that one of them would have to go. The war for desert palms had begun, and Marcus Chen had no idea he was already losing. Petition to address noise pollution in Desert Palms estates. We, the undersigned residents, are concerned about excessive noise levels caused by inappropriate pool equipment usage that violates the peaceful character of our community. The constant mechanical sounds and water disturbance are affecting property values, disturbing sleep patterns, and causing stress to both residents and their pets. We respectfully request that the Homeowners Association take immediate action to establish stricter noise ordinances and enforce quiet hours between 7 p.m. and 8 a.m. Below the formal language, 17 signatures sprawled across the page. In various handwriting styles, Marcus recognized some names: the Jeffersons from 2 streets over, the Martinez family who lived behind the community center, Mrs. Riley, who walked her golden retriever past his house every evening. People he'd smiled at, waved to, shared pleasantries with about the weather. His hands shook as he counted the signatures again. 17 neighbors who'd apparently decided he was a problem worth solving. Unbelievable, he muttered, crushing the petition in his fist before immediately smoothing it out again. He needed to understand what he was dealing with. The sound of a car door slamming made him look up. Dave Patterson, his across-the-street neighbor, was heading toward his own mailbox, coffee mug in hand and newspaper tucked under his arm. Had always been friendly. They'd shared a beer over the fence just last month, talking about the Cardinals' chances this season. "Morning, Dave," Marcus called out, waving the petition. "Did you see this?" Dave's step faltered. He glanced toward Marcus, then away, suddenly fascinated by something on his driveway. "Yeah, sorry, man. Karen came around Sunday evening. She seemed pretty upset, so you signed it." Marcus couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "Look, I don't really have a problem with your pool, but, ... Dave shrugged, his discomfort visible from across the street. She mentioned property values, said pools without proper noise control could affect everyone's home equity. "My wife's been worried about the market anyway," and the explanation died in the morning air. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't about dogs or noise levels. This was about fear, the kind that spread through suburban neighborhoods like wildfire, turning reasonable people into a mob armed with clipboards and HOA regulations. "Dave, you've lived here 5 years. Has my pool ever bothered you?" "No, but have you ever heard it running? Ever had trouble sleeping because of it?" Dave's face reddened. "It's not about me personally. It's about being a good neighbor, thinking about the community as a whole. By signing a petition against a neighbor you've never had a problem with." "Jesus, Marcus, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Dave's voice carried a sharp edge now. "Karen's been here since this place was built. She knows everyone. She's respected. Maybe just, work with her." Marcus watched Dave retreat into his house, coffee mug clutched like a shield. The betrayal felt sharper than Karen's initial complaint because it was wrapped in reasonableness. Dressed up as community concern, these people didn't hate him. They just didn't want to deal with the inconvenience of supporting him. By noon, Marcus had received 3 phone calls. The first was from Janet Reeves, president of the Desert Palms HOA board. Her voice professionally neutral, but carrying an undercurrent of annoyance. "We've received a formal complaint about noise levels from your property," she said without preamble. "I need to schedule a time to come out and assess the situation. When would be convenient for you?" Marcus asked, trying to match her professional tone. "Thursday at 10 a.m. I'll be bringing a noise meter and will need access to your backyard during normal operational hours." The second call came from City Code Enforcement. Officer Bradley Martinez spoke in the bored monotone of someone who'd made 1,000 similar calls. "We've received a noise complaint regarding your property at 1247 Saguaro. Doctor, I need to inform you that continued violations could result in citations and fines up to $500 per occurrence." "What violations?" Marcus asked. "I haven't violated anything. That's what the inspection will determine. I'll be out Thursday afternoon." The third call was the worst. Marcus was sitting in his kitchen, still processing the morning's events, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Chen, this is Rebecca Walsh from Channel 7 News. I understand you're involved in a neighborhood dispute over pool noise. We'd like to get your side of the story." Marcus's blood turned to ice. "How did who gave you my number?" "We received a tip about a noise pollution issue that's affecting an elderly resident and her emotional support animal. Our viewers are very interested in stories about community conflicts and property rights." "No comment," Marcus said quickly. But Rebecca Walsh wasn't finished. "We're planning to run the story on Thursday's evening broadcast. It would be better if you participated. Otherwise, we'll have to go with the information we have." Marcus hung up, his hands trembling. In 3 days, Karen Whitmore had transformed a simple complaint into a media circus. He tried to imagine his face on television, his name associated with elderly harassment and animal cruelty. His ex-wife would see it. His colleagues at the engineering firm would hear about it. The life he'd worked so hard to rebuild would be dissected for public consumption. That afternoon, Marcus did something he'd never done before. He called in sick to work and drove to the public library. He needed to understand what he was dealing with, and the internet at home felt too exposed, too vulnerable to whatever surveillance network Karen had apparently constructed. The research was sobering. Noise ordinances, he discovered, were subjective gold mines for determined complainants. Decibel readings could be manipulated by measurement, location, time of day, and ambient conditions. Even legal activities could be classified as nuisances if enough neighbors complained. Property values were indeed affected by problem neighbors, and pools were frequently cited in homeowners' disputes. But it was the forum posts that really opened his eyes. Reddit threads about neighbor wars revealed a world of escalating conflicts where reasonable people descended into madness over fence lines, parking spaces, and yes, pool noise. The common thread was always the same: one determined individual, with time, grievance, and community connections, could make life hell for anyone who crossed them. Started with a complaint about my dog barking, one post read, ended with her calling CPS on me, reporting me to the IRS, and putting nails in my driveway. Took 2 years and a restraining order to stop her. Pool noise complaint turned into a full campaign. She got half the neighborhood to sign petitions, filed fake police reports, even hired a lawyer to sue me for intentional infliction of emotional distress. Cost me $15,000 in legal fees before it was over. Marcus felt sick. He was seeing his future written in anonymous posts by strangers who'd walked this path before him. The pattern was always the same. Reasonable response met with escalation. Escalation met with desperation. Desperation met with destruction. He drove home as the sun began to set, painting the desert landscape in shades of orange and red that should have been beautiful but felt ominous. His house came into view, and he saw them immediately. News van parked on the street, camera crew setting up on the sidewalk, reporter in a blue blazer checking her microphone. Marcus pulled into his garage and sat in the darkness, engine ticking as it cooled. Through the thin walls, he could hear voices, the sound of equipment being moved. They were setting up for the evening news, preparing to broadcast his private conflict to anyone with cable television and an appetite for suburban drama. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the news van. This could all go away if you just do the right thing. A concerned neighbor, Marcus, stared at the message, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed new life closing in around him. Karen Whitmore hadn't just complained about his pool, she'd weaponized his entire community against him. The petition, the media, the HOA, the CDIT was a full-scale assault designed to make him surrender or be destroyed. He thought about Dave Patterson, who'd signed the petition rather than stand up for a neighbor he'd shared a beer with. He thought about Janet Reeves, who'd made him sound like a criminal for owning a pool that had been installed before he'd even moved to Arizona. He thought about his ex-wife, who'd always accused him of being too passive, too willing to avoid conflict. Maybe she'd been right. Maybe his entire life had been one long retreat from confrontation, and now he'd retreated so far that he had nowhere left to go. Marcus got out of his car and walked to the door leading into his house. On the other side, he could hear the distant sound of his pool filter humming its quiet song, the same sound that had brought him peace for 6 months. Tomorrow, officials would come to measure those sounds to determine if his sanctuary deserved to exist. But tonight, for the first time since Karen Whitmore had appeared on his doorstep, Marcus Chen felt something besides fear and confusion. Tonight, he felt anger clean, pure, and sharp as a blade. And as he stood in his darkened garage listening to the news crew prepare to destroy his reputation, he made a decision that would change everything. If Karen Whitmore wanted a war, she was about to discover that some transplants had deeper roots than she'd. Marcus stood in his backyard at 9:45 a.m. Thursday morning, watching Janet Reeves position her digital sound meter with the precision of a crime scene investigator. The HOA president was a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of rigid posture that suggested she'd never met a regulation she didn't love. She wore a clipboard like armor and treated Marcus's explanations with the enthusiasm of someone listening to a tax audit. The filter cycles every 4 hours, Marcus explained as she took readings from various positions around his pool. It's a variable speed pump, one of the quietest models available. The manufacturer's specifications show I'll need to see. "Those specifications," Janet interrupted, not looking up from her meter, "along with installation, permits, equipment, warranties, and your property survey showing compliance with setback requirements." Marcus felt his jaw clench. He'd lived in this house for 6 months, swum in this pool hundreds of times, maintained it according to manufacturer guidelines and city codes. Now he was being treated like a criminal because Karen Whitmore had convinced 17 neighbors to sign a piece of paper. "The readings I'm getting are well within city noise ordinances," he said, watching the digital display hover between 32 and 36 decibels. "That's quieter than a whisper." Janet made notes on her clipboard, with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd perfected the art of bureaucratic intimidation. Noise ordinances are just one factor. HOA covenants also address unreasonable disturbance and community harmony. The board has discretionary authority to interpret those standards. What does that mean? It means we'll review all evidence and make a determination based on community standards. Janet finally looked at him, her expression neutral but her eyes cold. The fact that multiple neighbors have complained suggests there's merit to their concerns. The sound of voices from the front yard interrupted them. Through the gate, Marcus could see Officer Martinez from code enforcement arriving, along with what appeared to be a television crew setting up on the sidewalk. His stomach dropped as he recognized Rebecca Walsh, the Channel 7 reporter, checking her appearance in a compact mirror. "I wasn't expecting media coverage," Janet said, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Neither was I," Marcus replied. Grimly, Officer Martinez was a compact man in his 40s who radiated the weary competence of someone who'd seen every variety of neighbor dispute imaginable. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and got straight to business, producing his own sound meter and beginning a methodical survey of the property. "What's the normal operating schedule for your equipment?" he asked. 6 a.m. to noon, then 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., Marcus replied. "The manufacturer recommends 8 hours of filtration per day minimum, and you've been following that schedule since installation." "Since I moved in?" "Yes. The equipment was installed 3 years ago by the previous owners." Officer Martinez nodded, making notes. His readings matched Janette's consistently under 40 decibels, well within legal limits. But as they worked, Marcus became aware of an audience gathering. Mrs. Patterson had positioned herself in her front yard, ostensibly watering plants, but clearly watching the proceedings. The Garcias had found reasons to check their mailbox repeatedly. Even some neighbors he'd never met were lingering on sidewalks, drawn by the unusual activity. Then Karen appeared. She emerged from her house dressed in what Marcus could only describe as Armora navy blazer, pressed slacks, and enough jewelry to stock a small boutique. She carried a leather portfolio and walked with the purposeful stride of someone heading into battle. Behind her trotted a small white dog that Marcus assumed was the famous Precious, though the animal seemed perfectly calm and alert rather than emotionally traumatized. "Mrs. Whitmore," Janet greeted her with obvious relief. "Thank you for coming. I have documentation," Karen announced, opening her portfolio with theatrical precision. "Noise readings, timestamps, photographic evidence, and a veterinary report confirming Precious's stress-related symptoms." Marcus blinked. "You took your dog to a vet for this?" Karen's eyes flashed dangerously. Dr. Morrison confirmed elevated cortisol levels, disrupted sleep patterns, and anxiety-related behavioral changes, all directly attributable to environmental stressors. She handed Janet a manila folder thick with papers. Marcus caught a glimpse of charts, graphs, and what appeared to be a detailed log of every sound his pool equipment had made over the past 2 weeks. The obsessive thoroughness was both impressive and terrifying. "I've also documented property line encroachments," Karen continued, producing a measuring tape and photographs. "The previous owner's pool equipment violates the required 5-foot setback from the property line. It should have been flagged during Mr. Chen's home inspection." Officer Martinez looked up from his sound meter with interest. Property line violations were serious business, potentially requiring expensive equipment, relocation, or even pool modification. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as Karen systematically dismantled every aspect of his legal position. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd trusted his real estate agent, his inspector, his lawyer. The idea that they'd all missed a basic setback violation seemed impossible, But then again, yesterday he would have. Said it was impossible for someone to turn his entire neighborhood against him over pool noise. 4 feet 8 inches, Karen announced, reading from her photographs. The city code requires 5 feet minimum from property lines for mechanical equipment. Janet and Officer Martinez exchanged glances that made Marcus's blood run cold. He was witnessing the moment when his complaint transformed from a nuisance issue into a code violation with real legal consequences. "We'll need to verify those measurements," Officer Martinez said carefully. "I've had them independently confirmed," Karen replied, producing another set of documents. Morrison and Associates Surveying performed a complete property analysis yesterday. Their report confirms multiple violations. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. In 4 days, Karen had assembled a legal case that would have taken him weeks to understand, let alone counter. She'd outmaneuvered him at every turn, transforming what should have been a simple neighbor dispute into a multi-jurisdictional enforcement. "Action, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Surely we can work something out without the time for working things out was Monday morning," Karen interrupted. "I offered you a reasonable compromise. You chose confrontation instead. I chose to use my legally installed pool according to manufacturer guidelines." "Your illegally positioned pool," Karen corrected coldly, "which has caused documented harm to my property values, my quality of life, and my pet's health." The word illegal hung in the desert air like a curse. Marcus could see Janet making notes, Officer Martinez measuring distances, the television crew capturing every moment of his humiliation. His neighbors watched from their safe distances, probably congratulating themselves on signing Karen's petition before the situation got really ugly. "Even if there are setback issues," Marcus said, grasping for any foothold, "that's not my fault. The equipment was installed by previous owners. I'm not responsible for their mistakes." Officer Martinez looked up from his tape measure. "Actually, property code violations transfer with ownership. When you purchased the house, you became responsible for bringing all structures into compliance." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He'd bought this house as a refuge, a place to rebuild his life after his divorce. He'd done everything by the book, followed every rule, been considerate to his neighbors. Now he was being told that his sanctuary was built on illegal foundations, and he was somehow responsible for fixing problems he'd never known existed. "What does that mean?" he asked, though he was afraid he already knew. "It means you have 30 days to bring the equipment into compliance or face daily fines of $250, Officer Martinez replied. "Depending on your property layout, that might mean relocating the equipment, modifying the pool, or removing it entirely." The casual mention of removing his pool hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about noise anymore, or dogs, or community harmony. This was about Karen Whitmore, systematically destroying everything he'd worked for, using the law as her weapon and his neighbor's cowardice as her ammunition. "You planned this," he said, staring at Karen with new understanding. "The noise complaint was just the beginning. You knew about the setback violations before you ever knocked on my door." Karen's smile was thin as a razor blade. "I've lived in Desert Palms for 23 years. Mr. Chen, I know every property line, every code requirement, every regulation in this community. When Harold and I moved here, we did our research. We understood that living in a planned community means following the rules that make civilized society possible. So you decided to destroy me because I didn't know about violations that happened before I lived here. I decided to protect my home, my property values, and my peace of mind from someone who clearly doesn't understand what it means to be a responsible neighbor." The television crew was capturing every word, and Marcus could imagine how this would play on the evening news. Elderly widow forced to defend herself against aggressive newcomer, longtime resident P. Marcus spent Friday night in his garage, surrounded by the detritus of his former life boxes he'd never unpacked, furniture he'd never found places for, and photo albums from a marriage that had ended in lawyers' offices and bitter silence. But tonight, he was looking for something specific. The manila folder his divorce attorney had given him containing what she'd called the nuclear option. He found it wedged between tax documents and insurance papers, its contents as explosive as he remembered. Private investigator reports, financial records, surveillance photographs Sarah had compiled during their divorce proceedings. including information about neighbors, property records, and what people did when they thought no one was watching. Marcus had never wanted to use this information, even during the worst moments of his divorce. When Sarah had tried to paint him as an abusive husband and unfit father, he'd taken the high road. But the high road, he was discovering, was a lonely place that led nowhere except to defeat. He opened his laptop and began to type. By Saturday morning, Marcus had filed 17 different complaints with various city and county agencies. He'd discovered that Karen's own property had violations. Her hedge exceeded the maximum height by 6 inches, her outdoor lighting wasn't properly shielded, and her irrigation system had been modified without permits. More importantly, he'd found something in the county records that made his blood sing with vindictive satisfaction. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 a.m., and Marcus opened it to find a man in his 30s wearing a polo shirt and carrying a clipboard. "Mr. Chen, I'm David Kim from the county assessor's office. We've received a complaint about possible unpermitted improvements to a property in this neighborhood. I need to inspect 1245 Saguaro Drive." Marcus smiled. "Karen Whitmore's house. She's right next door." He watched from his living room window as David Kim knocked on Karen's door. The conversation was brief but animated, Karen's voice rising to the familiar pitch of outraged authority. Marcus couldn't hear the words, but he could see her gesturing. Emphatically, her morning routine of calculated perfection disrupted by an unexpected challenge. 20 minutes later, Kim was measuring Karen's pool house, a structure that, according to county records, had been built without permits in 2018, the same year. Karen had filed complaints about 3 other neighbors for various code violations. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is war now. You have no idea what you've started," he typed back. "Neither did you." The response came immediately. "I've been fighting battles since before you were born. I buried a husband, raised 3 children, and survived a hostile takeover of my book club. You're just another selfish man who thinks he can bully his way through life." Marcus stared at the message, feeling something cold settle in his chest. Karen wasn't just angry, she was revealing something deeper, a lifetime of accumulated grievances. That had been searching for a target. He'd become the focal point for decades of frustration, the symbol of every man who'd ever dismissed her, ignored her, or failed to give her the respect she believed she deserved. But if Karen thought she was the only one with accumulated grievances, she was about to learn otherwise. Marcus's second wave of complaints hit on Monday morning. He'd spent the weekend researching Karen's history, using public records and social media to build a comprehensive picture of her life. What he'd found was a woman who'd spent 23 years in Desert Palms filing complaints against neighbors, joining committees, and making herself indispensable to the community power structure. But power structures, Marcus had learned during his divorce, were only as strong as their secrets. The first call came from animal control. Officer Sarah Martinez, no relation to the code enforcement officer, arrived at Karen's house with a warrant to inspect the conditions in which Precious was being kept. Someone had filed a complaint alleging that the dog was being kept in unsanitary conditions and denied proper veterinary care. "This is harassment." Karen screamed loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "My dog receives the finest care available." "Ma'am, we're just following up on a complaint," Officer Martinez replied with professional calm. "If everything's in order, this will be quick and painless." The second call came from the IRS. Karen had received a letter requesting documentation. For the home office deduction she'd claimed on her taxes for the past 5 years, someone had filed a whistleblower complaint suggesting that her consulting business was fraudulent. The third call was from the HOA board. Janet Reeves's voice was tight with barely controlled anger when she reached Marcus by phone. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "I'm not sure what you mean," Marcus replied innocently. "Don't play games with me." 3 board members have received complaints about Karen's conduct, including allegations that she's been using her position to harass neighbors. "We've got residents asking questions about her authority, her motivations, and whether she's been filing false reports." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction. Maybe those are legitimate concerns. Legitimate concerns don't include anonymous letters claiming she's been stealing from the HOA treasury or suggesting she's been having an affair with the pool maintenance contractor. The accusation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He hadn't filed any complaints about theft or adultery. Those were new allegations. which meant other people were piling onto his campaign, adding their own grievances to the mix. Karen's systematic persecution of him had created a monster that was now beyond his control. "Janet, I don't care what you did or didn't do," she interrupted. "This needs to stop before it destroys the entire community. Half the board wants to suspend both of you from the HOA pending a full investigation." Marcus hung up the phone with hands that trembled slightly. He'd wanted to fight back, to show Karen that he wasn't a passive victim. But the situation was metastasizing beyond his intentions, becoming something uglier and more destructive than he'd imagined. That afternoon, Marcus discovered just how ugly things had become. He was checking his mail when he noticed Dave Patterson working in his front yard, deliberately avoiding eye contact. The friendly neighbor who'd shared a beer with him just weeks ago now treated him like a dangerous stranger. "Dave," Marcus called out, "can we talk?" Dave looked up reluctantly, his face a mask of barely concealed hostility. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because my wife's been getting phone calls. Anonymous calls claiming you've been watching our house, taking pictures of our kids. She's scared to let them play outside." Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. "What?" "Dave, I would never. Someone's been spreading stories about you, saying you're unstable, that the divorce made you dangerous. Karen's been getting calls to people telling her to watch out, that you might snap." The malicious genius of it took Marcus's breath away. Someone he had no idea who was poisoning his reputation with surgical precision, turning his campaign of official complaints into a whisper network of personal destruction. His neighbors weren't just avoiding him now, they were actively afraid. "Of him, Dave? You know me. You know I'm not. I thought I knew you," Dave interrupted. "But this whole thing with Karen, it's gotten out of hand. People are talking about getting restraining orders, organizing neighborhood watch groups. The Hendersons are putting their house on the market because they don't want to live in a war zone." Marcus stared at his neighbor, seeing the fear and suspicion in his eyes. This was what Karen had wanted all along, not just to win their dispute, but to destroy him completely. She'd turned his own tactics against him, escalating the conflict until he became the neighborhood pariah. But as Marcus stood there, watching Dave retreat into his house like a man fleeing a crime scene, he realized something important. Karen was afraid of her aggressive campaign, her systematic documentation, her willingness to drag their dispute into public view. It all reeked of desperation. She'd thrown everything she had at him, but he was still standing. More importantly, he'd learned something crucial during his research into her background. Karen Whitmore wasn't the pillar of community respectability she pretended to be. She had secrets, vulnerabilities, and a past that would make interesting reading for the right audience. His phone buzzed with another anonymous text. "Last chance. Shut down the pool and leave desert palms, or I'll destroy everything you have left." Marcus typed back, "You already tried that. My turn." This time, there was no response. That evening, Marcus sat in his living room with a glass of wine and a folder full of documents that would change everything. He'd found Karen's weakness, the crack in her armor that would bring down her entire campaign. But using it would require crossing a line he'd never crossed before, abandoning the last pretense of moral high ground. As he opened the folder and began to read, Marcus Chen felt something inside him died the part that had believed in fairness, in doing the right thing, in the possibility of reasonable resolution. Karen Whitmore had killed that part of him systematically, complaint by complaint, lie by lie. Now it was time to return the favor.